Um, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the fifth and last meeting of the Art and Conversation series. Today, Marina and I are very excited to host two exceptional speakers that will talk about embodiment in art. I would like to remind you that the format of the seminar consists of two talks, after which the speakers will open the discussion by responding to each other's talk. But before introducing our first speaker, I would like to let you know that we will have two announcements at the end of this seminar, one about an opportunity for students and one about our next series. So please stay with us till the very end. But now, without further ado, I would like to introduce our first speaker, who is Shaun Gallagher, the professor of philosophy at the University of Memphis and at the University of Wollongong. His areas of research include phenomenology and cognitive sciences, particularly topics related to embodiment, self-agency and subjectivity, intersubjectivity, hermeneutics, and the philosophy of time. He led groundbreaking work in the interdisciplinary study of the mind, so we're very happy to have him here with us at the Art and Conversation Seminar. Professor Gallagher, thank you very much for accepting our invitation, and we look forward to your talk. We can't hear. I think you have to unmute yourself.
Keep forgetting about that. Okay.
No worries. Thank you.
Okay. And then I can go here. So you should see that now, yes?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, so my topic is a kind of an active approach to aesthetics. And here I just have to, oh, there you go. Here's an outline. I will try to very briefly give you a conception of the standard conceptions of aesthetic experience. I'm going to focus on the idea of aesthetic experience. I'll try to motivate an activist perspective on this by basically looking at performance rather than observing art. And then I will, in the end, try to say specifically what I think aesthetic experience is. So I'm going to kind of take a shortcut here rather than try to go through the whole history of aesthetics in 5 minutes. I'm just going to use the Stanford Encyclopedia entry on aesthetics by James Shelley as a good representation of what I take to be some of the points that I want to make about this. So Shelley starts by saying, introduced into the philosophical lexicon during the 18th century, the term aesthetic has come to be used to designate, among other things, a kind of object, a kind of judgment, a kind of attitude, a kind of experience, a kind of value. Aesthetics is primarily, I think, about the art object, the artwork. It's a judgment about the object, it's an attitude towards an object, an experience of an object, value attributed to an object. Shelley doesn't include the idea of a kind of action. So artwork signifies the object, not the work that goes into creating the object. Shelley proposes that the central question about aesthetic experience concerns the debate about internalism, where the idea is that the experience itself has some kind of aesthetic characteristics. This is associated with Beardsley, versus externalism, which is the idea that experience is really governed by the properties of the object, which is represented by Dickey. Beardsley, the internalist, argues that aesthetic experience reflects a unity, where unity is a matter of coherence or of completeness. And Dickey, the externalist, argues that these features, as described, are actually features that belong to the objects rather than to our experience. It turns out that in this debate, the externalist theory wins out and converts even Beardsley. who, as Shaun summarizes, says, an aesthetic experience just is an experience having aesthetic content. That is, an experience of an object as having the aesthetic features that it has. I want to argue that enactivism about aesthetic experience rejects both externalism and internalism. So, to gain an enactivist perspective on this issue, I think we need to shift away from the focus on the art object, where aesthetic experience is defined in terms of the observer-audience stance, the experience of the perceiver that takes the art object as an object. So, for example, I would say that I have an aesthetic experience when I stand in a museum looking at a painting. Or I have an aesthetic experience when I attend a concert or ballet and listen to the music or watch the dance. Here, in these cases, I'm an observer of the art. I think alternatively, we gain an enactivist perspective by starting with the experience of the artist or the performer in the performance. You can see immediately that if the performer has an aesthetic experience, the aesthetic character of her experience cannot be derived from the object, since the object, the dance, or the music, or the artwork, is in the process of being accomplished or enacted along with the performer's experience. Now, I admit that there are some issues about really what constitutes the artwork here. Is it the score? Is it the choreography? But I'm going to focus on the performance as an act rather than as an object. And Dufresne, for example, talks about the act fading away in the presence of the work. But I think that's just, again, the emphasis on the work, the work in the sense of the object rather than the process. So how then should we characterize aesthetic experience in the performance, in the act of performance? Well, I want to take a look at performance studies. So I'm going, again, to kind of short circuit all the debates in the performance literature. This is literature about dance, musical performance, acting, and so forth. And I want to simply present what I take to be an enactivist model, which I associate with a model that's referred to as a meshed architecture in the performance literature. And what I want to do is offer an enhanced version of this meshed architecture model. So there's this ongoing debate, I suppose, in the performance literature that starts with Dreyfus. In contrast to Dreyfus and his notion that skilled performance is mindless, there are other theorists, including Christensen, Sutton, McElwain, in a very nice paper in 2016, who propose a meshed architecture model, which involves an integration of cognitive and bodily sensory motor processes in performance. Here's the way Sutton explains it. He says, skill is not a matter of bypassing explicit thought to let habitual actions run entirely on their own, but of building and accessing flexible links between knowing and doing. The forms of thinking and remembering, and what he has in mind here are things like self-reflective thinking, planning, predicting, deliberation, selective target control, conscious monitoring, a sense of one's rightly configured body, a kind of enhanced pre-reflective awareness, possibly, what they refer to as situation awareness. So these forms of thinking and remembering, he says, which can in some circumstances reach in to animate the subtle kinesthetic mechanisms of skilled performance must themselves be redescribed as active and dynamic. So the mesh involves, as they describe it, a broadly hierarchical division of control responsibilities, with cognitive control usually focused on strategic aspects of performance and automatic body schematic or motoric processes more concerned with implementation. So this initial statement of the meshed architecture model is, I've argued, too top-down and I think overly intellectualized, right? So there's a lot to say about that, which I'm not going to say here. So I have a few recent papers where I make this the argument. What I want to suggest is a more complex, enhanced conception of the meshed architecture. And I will introduce three different points to make it a more complex thing. First, a concept of intrinsic control. So I want to say that control is not entirely top-down, but rather on what we might call a vertical axis. There are important bottom-up processes, body schematic processes that are not simply automatic. They may be close to automatic, but they're not purely automatic. There's also what I would call a kind of horizontal axis that integrates ecological, social, and normative factors. These are factors that have an impact on performance and that really shape a person's performance. And finally, I think something that's been overlooked by Sutton and his colleagues, affective processes that in some way modulate the dynamics of the integration on both vertical and horizontal axes. So I want to use this more enhanced conception of meshed architecture to characterize performance. I think this is an enriched model, enriched not simply along the vertical and horizontal axes, but in the dynamical relations among all of these elements, so that we start to think of the mesh more as a dynamical gestalt of processes in which vertical and horizontal are clearly just explanatory abstractions. So again, there's much to say about that, which I don't really have time to go into. This dynamical gestalt, of course, I would say involves embodied, ecological, extended, enactive processes, the kinds of things that we talk about in a kind of 4E approaches to such topics. Coupling relations of brain, body, and environment. These factors and the dynamical processes constrain or constitute the performance and the performer's experience. Okay, now the question is, what is it that makes the experience of the performer aesthetic experience? I want to characterize the experience of the performer just in that way, as a kind of aesthetic experience, which is not to say that it has some intrinsic phenomenological features that make it aesthetic. That would be a kind of internalism. And it's not to say that what makes it aesthetic just is that it is an experience of the performed art, which would be a kind of externalism. Rather, I want to say that the performance includes, as a constitutive part of the dynamical gestalt, the performer's experience. More precisely, there is a codependent, reciprocal, or organizational relation between performance and experience. So I try to make this clear by engaging in a set of disagreements with a variety of theories of aesthetics that take the observer-audience stance as primary. So consider Maria Brinker's notion of what she calls the aesthetic stance. following the Kantian idea of a practical disengagement that accompanies image perception, she suggests that the perception of painting or sculpture not only has different affordances, but affords a sort of halt to our own ongoing environmental interactions. Or in the case of viewing film or theatrical play, she says perception of action does not afford the perceiver an overt complementary response beyond simply watching what is being presented. So this aesthetic stance is an engagement that is a kind of halting at the edge of action, which is her phrase for it, halting at the edge of action. But clearly, the aesthetic experience of the performer cannot be a halting at the edge of action. The dancer, musician, or actor, the performer in the performance, cannot halt. If we can say, with respect to the observation audience perspective, that there is something like a short-circuiting of interactional affordances, which is Brinker's view, and it's in fact something I've argued myself in a paper that was somewhat critical of Friedberg and Gallese, which we can come back to later in discussion if we want. And in any case, that clearly cannot be the case in performance, since the performer is engaged in, not disengaged from, or disinterested in the performance. I think this also undermines the type of claim made by Hein, who argues that the aesthetic experience of the performer is actually derivative from the observer-audience stance, as if, and I think this is what he means, as if the performer is kind of taking an observer stance on her own performance. So to flesh out the idea of a reciprocal or organizational relation between performance and the experience of the performer that makes the latter aesthetic, I appeal to the notion of what I'll call a double attunement. And I take this from the work of Richard Wollheim, who talks about a twofold experience that characterizes the double aspect of how we experience artistic depiction. Distinguishing, he distinguishes between what is represented in a painting from the technique of representation. We can see both of those things in a painting. Now, one important point from Wollheim is this, that the twofold consciousness of a painting, of the content and the technique involved, these two aspects, he says, are of a single experience that I have. Two aspects that are distinguishable but also inseparable. They are two aspects of a single experience. They are not two different experiences. Now, Mary Smith, in the context of theatrical acting, uses Wollheim's notion of the twofold to characterize the distinction between character and action, or actor. Now, both Wollheim and Smith, however, focus on the observer-audience perspective. But I think that this concept of the twofold can be reworked as this notion of a double attunement and we can apply it to the performer herself. So, for example, in acting, the double attunement in performance is the actor's perspective on the character she is portraying and on her own acting process. The actor's empathic consciousness directed towards the character that she's playing is folded into the actor's sense of technique in portraying this character. There's a meshed, I would say, pre-reflective self-awareness of whether or not she is getting it right as she is performing. And I think this fits well with the model of meshed architecture that includes intrinsic processes of control and affect and the horizontal normative factors that enter into the performance. And I think it generalizes to apply to other kinds of performances, including dance and music. This double attunement is accomplished in the performance. It describes a mindful way of being in the flow of performance. It's one kind of coupling of performer and the various factors of the meshed dynamical gestalt. And it explains why the performer cannot halt at the edge of action. So if we accept this idea, we may also be in a position to reverse the proposal made by Hein and say that the aesthetic experience of the observer is derived or derivative from the performer stance. That is, we could characterize the observer-audience perspective as a kind of performance, a kind of skill. This is something that John Carvalho has suggested in a recent book, and he takes it to be an enactive principle. And we can think that there is no in-principle difference between the aesthetic experiences of the observer and the performer. I think there are lots of differences between those two kinds of experience. But in terms of what makes them aesthetic, I think we don't have to make a really strict distinction there. If, as we watch a dance performance, and this is an old idea, it goes back earlier even than Walter Terry in 1959, as he puts it, when we watch a dance performance in the observer mode, then we respond kinesthetically to a dance movement. We take part in the performance of dance itself, and by taking part, we know more perfectly what each movement means. If, following enactivism then, we treat perception as a form of action, then we may not halt at the edge of action, even in the observer-audience perspective. We rather inactively engage with art. And in that case, there would be some kind of meshed architecture involved even in skilled observation. A mesh of elements that, in regard to the plastic arts, may include the artwork itself, the museum, cultural practices, other people, as well as cognitive, affective, and motoric processes, which have been described, I think, very nicely by Merleau-Ponty. One last bonus point here. Enactivism, I think, resolves the internalism versus externalism debate, even for the observer-audience perspective, just as it does for the performer perspective. This would entail a shift from the Wollheimian externalist position, where the twofold, as he identifies it, in the content and the technical quality, are both in the artwork, in the object. It would be a shift to an enactivist conception of a gestalt, a meshed architecture, that includes the observer's skill and affective experience, along with the broader ecological, cultural, and normative contexts. Okay, well, thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Gallagher. That was an extremely interesting talk. I'm sure we have a lot of questions and comments during the discussion. Thanks a lot. And we are now having our second speaker. It's Vittorio Gallese, Professor of Psychobiology and Cognitive Neuroscience at the University of Parma. Now, Professor Gallese is known for his groundbreaking research on mirror neurons. He currently uses that research to explain how we engage with art. He recently published a book, The Empathic Screen, Cinema and Neuroscience. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation. Professor Gallese, we look forward for your talk.
Okay. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. So first of all, let me thank you for your most kind invitation. It's a privilege to take part to this very interesting series of webinars, and it's a even greater pleasure to have the chance to meet and discuss with Shaun Gallagher today. Okay, embodied simulation and experimental aesthetics. I want to start by proposing some definitions of aesthetics and aesthetic experience. Then I will quickly jump to what is more specific, perhaps, of my perspective, namely the embodiment of images seen from the vantage point of the brain body. I will introduce embodied simulation as a new model of perception and imagination, a few empirical results, and according to how am I doing with time, I will be forced to cut some of them or maybe all of them, and some preliminary conclusion before getting to the debate. Okay, what do I mean by aesthetics? I think I would side with Mark Johnson, who in 2018, in this book, The Aesthetics of Meaning and Thought, wrote, begin quote, aesthetics extends broadly to encompass all the processes by which we enact meaning through perception, bodily movement, feeling, and imagination. In other words, all meaningful experience is aesthetic experience. And I think this eliminates some or many of the concerns that were put forward by Nadal in his opening webinar of this series. So I think it's going to be a purchase if in this enterprise stick to the etymological sense of the word aesthesis, the multimodal perception of the world through the body, through the senses. A further element that perhaps qualifies my approach is that I see aesthetic experience as a social practice, okay? But I'll come to that later on. So a few years ago, in 2007, with an art historian, David Friedberg, we proposed that in order to address from an empirical point of view the topic of aesthetic experience, it would be useful to first bracket the artistic dimension of visual works of art and focusing rather on the embodied phenomena that are induced in the course of contemplating such works by virtue of their visual content. So let's treat artworks as images to start with. And in this paper, we illustrated the neural mechanisms that supposedly might underpin the empathetic power of images, to quote David's famous book, and show that embodied simulation and the empathetic feelings it generates play a crucial role in aesthetic experience. But how to define experience? And I think that John Dewey offers an interesting definition, which I'll read. Begin quote, experience, oh, the red emphasis is mine. Experience is the result, the sign, and the reward of that interaction of organism and environment, which, when it is carried to the full, is a transformation of interaction into participation and communication. So in order for an interaction to qualify as an experience, it has to be carried to the full, transforming the interaction into participation and communication, which I think capture the social nature of human experience. A further interesting element can be offered by Hans Grumberg, that in this quite thought-provoking book that he published in 2004, The Production of Presence, What Meaning Cannot Convey, he wrote what we call aesthetic experience. I want there to read the German, good for you, always provides us with certain feelings of intensity we cannot find in the historically and culturally specific everyday worlds that we inhabit, which I think capture another very crucial element of aesthetic experience when we speak of aesthetic experience of cultural artifacts, or to be as broad as possible, man-made images, okay? So we don't need to stick to particular historical connotation of art, art definition, and the like. So there are some objects whose perception is particular, and I side with Shaun in the necessity or the attempt to avoid both an internalist and an externalist view, nevertheless, the fact remains that there are objects that are special under many respects, but I won't have time to delve into this. So what we basically decided to sketch an agenda for was to search for the genesis of aesthetic experience. The experience of images can be empirically studied to reveal its bodily and neurobiological grounding elements, and the purpose of this empirical journey should be to accomplish a better understanding of what the concepts referring to aesthetics and art are made of, which are concepts, they are words. We want to deconstruct these words and concepts. So how do we embody images? What images? I mean, I think one should be very careful in distinguishing. We can perceive the physical world, but we can perceive pictorial representation of the physical world. We can perceive artistic pictorial representation of the physical world, but we can also perceive artistic non-representational pictorial images. I think that at the basis of the perception of all these different objects are underpinning common neurobiological and bodily mechanisms, which, however, are particularly modulated by a variety of modulating factors. So why I take the liberty of characterizing my approach as unconventional, because it stems from two starting assumptions, which to my knowledge are quite different from the mainstream neuroscientific approach to aesthetics. First, vision is a process far more complex than the mere activation of the so-called visual brain. Why? Because our visual experience of the world is the outcome of a multimodal integration in which the motor system is one of the key players. I immediately declare my bias favoring action and the motor system as the key binding glue our body offers to us to integrate the multiplicity of hypostases of the world. Second, aesthetic experience has to be framed within the broader notion of social cognition and intersubjectivity, because works of art, cultural artifacts, symbols, whatever you want to call them, are always mediators of the relationship between the subjectivities of their creators and their beholders or experiencers. So how do we frame all these fascinating but bloody complex problematic issues starting from this guy? Well, first, by challenging the visual brain imperialism. What do I mean by that? Observing the world, as I said, is more complex than activating the posterior part of your brain. Why? Because vision is multimodal. It encompasses the activation of motor, somatosensory, emotion-related brain networks. Our motor potentialities shape and define the world we perceive. Our brain body expresses the range of potential relationships with the world that lead to the establishment of a relational self, modeling and delimiting the horizon of the world in which we live, our Umwelt. So we know and understand this Umwelt by virtue of the relational potentialities instantiated by our body, which in turn shape and model the brain's sensory motor schemas. This is very important. So here you have scattered on the screen the description of the functionality of different group of neurons you might recall from the ventral part of the premotor cortex of the macaque brain. Neurons that control movements of the head, of the arm, but that also respond to tactile stimuli, visual stimuli, auditory stimuli, all impinging upon the very same body part those neurons control the movement of. Here is another example. If you move more rostrally in area F5, you may recall goal-related grasping neuron that control the grasping of particular physically shaped three-dimensional object, but at the same time, the very same neuron, in the absence of any overt movement, would still selectively respond to the very same object, three-dimensional object, with a visual response. So there is no movement, but part of your motor system is particularly active. So this, in my words, qualified as an instantiation of motor simulation. And if you interfere with the ventral premotor cortex while people are supposed to judge the shape of a real three-dimensional object they are looking at, they make more errors in this visual discrimination, shape recognition task. So frontoparietal motor areas are neurally integrated, not only to control action, but also to serve the function of building an integrated, bodily formatted dots. Representation, then Shaun immediately gets nervous. Representationalism, internalism, mapping perhaps is more neutral. To be honest, I don't care what kind of word we use to describe this sensory motor schematic functioning of a part of our brain, be it a map, be it a representation, provided that we qualify the format of that representation. That's not a big issue for me. It is for radical enactivism. And actions, objects, locations to which actions are directed are mapped in such a way. So the aesthetic experience of man-made images, as I said at the beginning, qualifies for me as a mediated form of intersubjectivity. So intersubjectivity, we know, has an intercorporeal side, which is not patently evident in overt behavior, but even in the hidden workings of part of our brain neuromotor circuits. Mirror neurons are an instantiation of this connection, connecting the agent to the observer by activating the same neural resource. What's interesting for our discussion about aesthetic is that more recently our colleagues in Tübingen revealed when testing mirror neurons that basically all tested mirror neurons respond both to the observation of naturalistic action, but also to its digital representation on a bidimensional screen. Half of them do not show any preference in terms of intensity of their discharge to either of the two. The remaining half prefer, so to speak, the naturalistic action, but they still strongly respond also to the digital bidimensional representation of that action. And just allow me to tell you what might seem to be paradoxical, but this is the plain truth. The vast majority of brain imaging studies where we try to establish a meaningful correlation between brain states and how we map reality, we experience reality, use as stimuli representations, digital representations of reality. So mirroring mechanisms for action occupy this region of the human brain. Even static images of actions lead to the activation of the motor system of the still observer. The more dynamic they look, the stronger the motor simulation in the observer brain. But let me tell you something about imagination. So imagine, first of all, that you are looking at the scene I'm going to show you from the very same vantage point enjoyed by the macaque, whose neuron was recorded during this particular testing and whose sound you're going to hear shortly. So this is the response of a mirror neuron when the macaque is observing Evelyn Köhler performing the action physically in front of her. If she mimes the action, the neuron doesn't respond at all. But what in the following case, when the macaque can only imagine the hand-object interaction? No big change. But again, if the object isn't there, so what is imagined is not a grasping, but something meaningless to the macaque, who most likely doesn't entertain the idea or concept of, mimicking, again, we have almost no spikes at all. And this is the visual representation of the discharge of that very same neuron. So the activation of motor or visual areas, I show you what happens in the premotor cortex of the macaque at the single neuron level, but there's plenty of evidence through brain imaging in the human brain that the activation of motor or visual areas during mental or motor visual imagery occur, and this qualifies, in my hand, as forms of embodied simulation, which likely define the experiential backbone, not only of what we perceive, but also of what we experience by merely imagining. And I want to emphasize, my body is still, I don't move any single body part, my muscles are relaxed. A part of my motor system still is very active. This is motor simulation. So the boundary between the real world and the fictional one is far less sharp than one might have thought. Seeing real actions, their representation, share the activation of parts of cerebral circuits they use in common. In macaques, as I showed you a minute ago, this holds even at a single neuron level. This dual neural activation can be described in terms of neural reuse and of the correlated notion of embodied simulation. Let's apply this logic to the analysis of a painting like this wonderful Caravaggio. We look at this image, which is static, but the more we look at it, the more we enjoy the beholding of a narrative. There's something going on here. There are actions, there are emotional reactions, there are expressions, there is an atmosphere, there is a lot that we can derive while beholding this still static image. Through the movement captured in the image of an instant, the observer transforms the instant into the story of a movement that comes from the past and continues projected into the future. If you allow me a more reductionist phrasing, I would add that we recognize the instant as part of a movement that has a past and a future. The past is the movement that has taken that body or that limb up to the moment depicted in the image we are observing. The future is the predictable spatial trajectory and the final point of arrival that body or limb will plausibly eventually reach after a time inversely proportional to the kinetic energy deployed. This is something which is part of our sensory motor bodily experience. So embodied simulation transforms the image into the figure of a story. In the exploration of mirroring mechanism, we were the first to demonstrate that such logic applies also to the domain of emotions and to the domain of somatosensory sensation like touch or pain. I need to go very quick here. I'm happy to develop during discussion. So the mirror mechanism, and I like more to speak about the mechanism rather than mirror neurons, also to reduce the potential risk of anthropomorphizing these poor motor neurons that look totally like others under many respects. What is important, interesting, is the mechanism instantiated by these neurons. And what they instantiate is a mapping of the sensory aspects of actions, emotion, or sensation of someone else onto the perceived zone neural mapping of the same action, emotion, or sensation. And according to my hypothesis, this would enable one to perceive the action, emotion, or sensation of others as if, in a way, performing that action or experiencing some content of that emotion or sensation, which doesn't imply or require contagion of any kind. While I simulate, my body is still, even when I look someone laughing, there can be emotional contagion through facial mimicry, but I can be totally still and passive and still recognize that emotion, because part of the neural circuit that normally activate when I experience that very same emotion activate in my brain when I'm witnessing the expression on the face of someone else. So the bodily contingencies posed by the specific configuration of the human body not only constrain behavior, but also one neural mechanism can map. This is why I don't take the challenge, the argument that since we refer to neural mapping or neural bodily formative representation, we are back to a good old internalism, because this neural mapping is the outcome of the negotiation, the constant pragmatic, performative negotiation between our body and the physical world. So by neural reuse, different brain areas participate in different functions through their dynamical engagement within different brain circuits, as has been, in my opinion, convincingly put forward more than 10 years ago by Michael Anderson. A given cognitive function can be supported by a variety of brain circuits, but the newer in evolutionary term a cognitive function is the wider, according to him, convincingly, as I said, the wider is the brain circuit underpinning it. So the activation of embodied simulation is the non-conscious recall of the background bodily knowledge that we recruit in several different situations. When witnessing other actions or the expression of their emotion and sensation, when remembering past experiences, when planning future actions, when engaging in fictional experiences, when processing linguistic descriptions of facts, actions, and events. All things I don't have time to deal with, of course. So, embodied simulation provides a unified account of nonverbal and verbal aspects of interpersonal relations that likely play an important role in shaping the self, its identity, and shared cultural practices. It reveals a unified functional mechanism connecting physical reality with imaginary/fictional worlds, and links at the functional level symbol making, the creative aspects, and symbol reception. So when looking at the graphic sign, we unconsciously simulate the gesture that has produced it, and this unconscious response includes bodily framing and sensory motor activation of the simulating kind. And we demonstrated that by using graphic signs like alphabet letter, Chinese ideograms, and scribble. All these three sorts of stimuli lead to the activation of the motor cortex of a still observer, more these two than the latter one, which is also interesting. But we got, similar results with non-representational abstract art, like Lucio Fontana cuts on canvas or Franz Klein brushstrokes, and we apply the same logic to movies investigating camera movements and editing, montage. So the role of bottom-up, bodily-driven sensory motor processes in the explicit evaluation of aesthetic beauty are going to be the very last part of my talk. So far, all the things I've said can be applied to a level of aesthetic experience that we might define the Einfühlung-like aesthetic experience, or the empathic aspect of what's going on when I am facing a man-made image endowed with artistic value, for example. But what about when I'm supposed to take a more detached stance according to a long tradition in aesthetics, in order to evaluate the objective quality of that specific image. We try to answer this question by asking non-art experts, garden variety participants, to provide an aesthetic evaluation of the artistic beauty of images that could be the portrayal of physical pain or relaxed neutral faces, all taken from paintings from the 16th and 17th century. But we asked participants to produce this aesthetic evaluation in two conditions: when they were relaxed or when they were actively frowning, and we were monitoring their frowning by recording the activation of the corrugator supercilii muscles. And what we found quite interesting in this study is that when actively frowning, they saw the pain pictorial representation as more beautiful than when they evaluated the very same paintings when the facial musculature was relaxed. But this manipulation of the bodily posture of the face of beholder had no impact when they had to rate the artistic beauty of the relaxed facial paintings. What is also interesting is that the overt activation of corrugator supercilii was correlated to the empathetic traits and the art experience of the participants. So participants' empathetic traits and art experience, so how often they went to museums or art exhibition and the like, correlated directly with the amplitude of the motor enactment effect on aesthetic beauty judgment. So these components are related, although we cannot, of course, claim any causal relationship between these correlated aspects. And we more recently ran an fMRI experiment with the very same stimuli, but with the addition of no art pain and no art neutral faces. And again, participants in the scanner were looking at these images while they were asked to detect whether they were showing pain or not. At the end of the brain imaging session, we presented the same stimuli again, and we asked this time to do an aesthetic judgment of the same images. And we found that the brain circuit that normally is active when I feel pain or when I witness the physical pain of someone else were also activated when beholding the painting showing physical pain. What is more interesting that the higher the activation of empathy for pain brain regions, the higher the aesthetic judgment of artistic beauty of painful facial expression. But we didn't detect any correlation of the same kind when correlating aesthetic judgment with the increased activation of a purely visual area like the fusiform face area, which was, of course, activated since they were watching human faces. So I'm almost done. Man-made images are the locus of virtual interaction, constituting a sophisticated form of mediated intersubjectivity. These elements are connected to the function of embodied simulation. The ways through which beholders connect to images are not just offline mental processes, but primarily online bodily forms of intersubjectivity, although of the simulative kind. The meaning of images does not depend only on concepts and proposition, but it relies also on sensory motor schemas which get the viewer literally in touch with them, shaping a multimodal form of embodied simulation which exploits all the potentialities of our brain body, which in turn, as I said before, constrain the way neural networks map our relation to the world. Embodied simulation as a model of perception and imagination generates, according to my hypothesis, the peculiar quality of the embodied scene as that plays a significant role in an aesthetic experience. It's one important ingredient of our appreciation of human creative expressions. Cognitive neuroscience can bridge nature and culture by studying the brain-body mechanism supporting both the creative process and the reception of its results. By studying the brain-body in relation to cultural artifacts and their reception, we can better understand the building blocks of aesthetic experience and the genesis of aesthetic concepts. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Gallese. It was incredibly interesting. And we can now start the discussion. We usually start the discussion from our speakers commenting each other talks. So if you want to comment, you're welcome. Thank you.
Well, I could start. First of all, thank you, Vittorio. It was great, very rich, lots of things to think about. I have a question that has to do with Maria Brinker's interpretation, which is this kind of Kantian detachment idea about the observation of art. And she cites empirical studies which suggest that the default network is activated. And her interpretation of that is that the default network activates when we are not involved in a task, but rather somehow or other, whatever we're doing is different from that. And so she uses that as kind of evidence to back up her idea that it's at the edge of action, but it's not inactive in a direct way. So I wonder what you think of that, or if you have ideas about the default network.
Thank you. It's a very interesting question and point. Well, first of all, tell me something that does not activate the default mode network. In my opinion, we do not have yet a very clear idea of how to frame the functionality of this part of the brain, provided that we can designate all those disparate mesial areas as belonging to a system which maps in a one-to-one fashion with a set of cognitive function, which I seriously doubt. That said, I was happy until recently to confine our empirical investigation for a variety of reasons to the more basic level of engagement with an artwork, which doesn't necessarily require the expression of an objective judgment, or even how much do I like that object. We wanted to investigate the experience as such, with no particular constraint, cognitive top-down modulatory effect on the beholders we were investigating. But of course, the curiosity remained. We had many debates, also with David Friedberg, on what happens when we reach what to many really characterizes aesthetic engagement with artworks, namely the expression of a judgment. And I would say I'm not an expert in this field. I'm not an expert in aesthetics, neither a philosopher, but my gut feeling is that in these aesthetic traditions of a few centuries, at least in the Western world, when we speak of aesthetic judgment, most people tend to side theoretically with Brinker. And so I need to stay clear of my passion, of my involvement, because it has to be, I think this is nonsense, in my opinion. I think we are always engaged. Our body is always engaged in whatever cognitive enterprise we want to start. Our is a very limited case, specifically focused on emotion. We define the region of interest that normally are active when we feel pain, because the goal of our experiment was very limited. So this empirical result would push me to continue this empirical investigation to see to what extent is it really true that even when we are formally required to express an objective evaluation of beauty or of a given cultural artifact, the body, we can forget about the body. I don't think so, and I think we'll try to go on in this.
Yeah, good. I mean, I think I agree with just about everything you're saying here, and it's also we share something in common, which is that neither of us are experts, as you say, in aesthetics. So we're coming at this from different perspectives, but I find it fascinating. And again, you know, as we've talked a lot before, we agree on so much in this respect. I think there is a little bit of a difference, you know, between the simulationist view and the enactivist view, but otherwise, yeah, we shouldn't get too hung up on notions of representation or anything like that. Good.
I don't know yet how radical my take on embodied cognition is. I was reading you yesterday, and the paper you recently published that you co-authored with Rushinska. So you offer a very useful and interesting taxonomy, so to speak, of the field. So under many respects, I recognize myself as a hard embodied cognition supporter, but on other respects, when it comes to imagination, when it comes to the notion of having something that is going on in spite of a totally still body, I don't know exactly, but I think we share a lot more than what divides us. I always thought that. Yeah, and I always thought you.
Thanks a lot. We can now start with the questions. I'll begin with the first one. So you both, in a way, see art as a social practice. And Professor Gallagher mentioned interactional affordances. And I just have a question to both of you, but first to Professor Gallagher. Can you please elaborate a bit more about what do you mean by interactional affordances? And do you both think that there is any difference between communication in real life and communication via art? I mean, if you think that art is a social practice, are there any differences between engagement with art and our engagement now during this communication? Because we exchange meanings, and basically the same happens when we engage with art. Are there any differences or not? Thank you.
No, yeah, I think definitely yes. The answer is yes. So again, Brinker, but this is something that I argued also, that we have a change of you know, in observing art. There's a shift in our landscape of affordances, so to speak, or our field of affordances. Our affordances change. So when we view a painting of a particular person, let's say, we can't interact with that person in our everyday kind of interactive way. So there's a difference of affordance of what we're able to do or how we can interact with a painting as opposed to a person who might be there. And this is yeah, a change therefore in kind of intersubjective affordances that we have in art. So yeah, I think that definitely there is this kind of shift that occurs.
Yeah, I totally agree. There are differences, but these differences are differences mainly, I think, in focus and in intensity, as Grumberg seemed to suggest. So I see. Well, okay, let's use the term art, but I think we understand each other. When we say art, we don't want to get stuck with the historical definition of art. Let's talk about symbol making or cultural artifacts. no matter how you name those objects, it is clear that those objects reveal different sides of nature, of reality, that normally remain hidden when we communicate with others. If so there is a referential quality in communication that I don't know how to put it into words, but it's definitely more flat with what's going on in our engagement with cultural artifacts. So cultural artifacts are, in my opinion, a sort of augmented reality. We are still immersed in reality, but we perceive of reality certain aspects that cannot be communicated unless using our social practices in a ritualized, or anyway, in a very specific way. But the building elements, the bricks, are always the same. I mean, it's not that we have quasi emotion when I see Macbeth and have a real emotion when I find out that my neighbor is annoying me. And it's the same flesh and bones.
Yeah. So I would agree, and I would say, in some way, in contrast to interacting with a real person, interacting with a piece of art closes down some affordances, but opens up lots of other affordances and makes all kinds of possibilities available to us. So I agree with that.
Yeah, that's what Maria Brinker uses the term beholding affordances, which I don't really understand what does it mean in psychological terms, but she uses that as art specifically affords beholding. Thank you very much. We have a question from Nicole. Nicole, if you please.
Yes, thank you very much both for your talks. I have a question for both of you, and I'd like to start with Professor Gallagher. I like very much your focus on performance and on the focus of the artist perspective when there is art making, and and artistic performance is a particular case of this. I was wondering if you think, in terms of interdisciplinarity, what will be the contribution of psychology in the study of this of performance? What do you think psychology could contribute to your philosophical take on this?
I think it maybe depends on what kind of psychology we're talking about. So, I mean, psychology is such a broad area, and certainly neuropsychological experiments are very interesting, as Vittorio has indicated. Developmental psychology might be able to say something about how our aesthetic tastes develop within a kind of cultural setting. I think that might be very important. Social psychology would probably tell us something else about how, in fact, we relate normatively to our aesthetic, our experiences of art.
Yeah.
So I think it's just, I think we'd have to be much more specific about what kind of a psychology we want to talk about.
I guess I was thinking more of perhaps cognitive psychology, and or phenomenology, in the sense of understanding which is the process of which are the what's the nature of the artistic process, and in which way artists are engaged during the performance. So I was thinking, I was thinking more of this kind of contribution.
Yeah. I would say if we're including phenomenology in here, then Simon Hofting's studies, I think, are really quite interesting in terms of his study of musical performance, the Danish string quartet, with phenomenological interviews, trying to get at, exactly what are they experiencing when they are playing together on, in their performance. So I think there's a lot of work to do there. I think so. That's important stuff too, I think.
Thank you very much. To Professor Gallese, I was wondering, what do you think is the relationship between image properties and image qualities and the experience that we have of images? Do you think that is it worth to relate those two things? I'm thinking of visual properties such as symmetry, curvature, that we know are basic features for our visual perception. In which way we can correlate those with the experience of images?
Well, first of all, I think it's quite problematic, or at the very least, pretty challenging to generalize this kind of discourse when we speak of beholder experiences, unless we are dealing with very basic relational facts that happens in the body of the beholder. When it comes to the some intrinsic qualities of the object of the contemplation of the experience, I think we should count a huge inter-individual variability, which has to be properly investigated when you, for example, I mean, we were interested a few years ago in learning more about the social practice, the autonomic correlate of the social practice of watching a movie in a movie theater, confronting heart rate variability when watching the same short clips from different movies projected on the screen of this small movie theater in mid Berlin, when people were alone in the company of three other partners. And it turns out that it makes a difference according to your baseline level of activation of the vagal system. So if you lose that peculiar distinguishing feature, you don't understand, you don't have a clue, because all this is averaged together. So it's very difficult. I think that there are qualities of the image that evoke specific experiences in beholders, but that may not be able to be generalized to all. I think the material quality, the materic quality of the image, for example, is definitely playing a role in evoking a bodily reaction, not only in terms of the activation of the tactile, of part of the brain tactile system, but also at the level of the, for example, we have investigated to which extent people feel compelled to touch the image, and we are dealing with digital artworks. And it turns out that if you show an enlarged view of the same image, so the equivalent of a close-up in filmic terms, people feel more compelled to touch it than when you present the whole image of the digital artwork. They feel closer and they feel more urge to touch it when you show the close-up. So this is again a demonstration that if you play with the intrinsic quality of the image, there's definitely something going on. But I would never dare to reduce this to 10 laws of the brain as Rama did 20 years ago. I think you can go there.
Thank you very much. Nicole, you have no more. You don't have any questions.
Not for the time being.
Okay, we have a question from Stefano. If you please, Stefano.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much to both speakers. My question is to Professor Gallagher, one, and then maybe to Vittorio. You divided the different kinds of art in basically in performing art and visual art as painting, let's say, and consider your enactive theory. But don't you think that a painting can be seen as a performance too, what's the difference between a ballet performance or a Degas pictures? Can't you see? I know that there's a difference, of course, but can't you see in the Degas picture a narrative behind, and you can see express the movement, what is before and after this kind of. So I would see also as the painting as a kind of performance. You have, if you have the expertise to appreciate what you are seeing. And I don't know if I can pose a question to Vittorio Gallese or later.
You can do now. Yeah.
I can do now. Vittorio, what do you think that expressing and seeing, simulating motor components from the side of the viewer can augment, can increase the aesthetic appreciation of the artworks, or are two different kinds? One thing is to perceive it and simulating your motor component processes and the sensory motor cortex, and this increase also your aesthetic evaluation, or the aesthetic evaluation is something else that is detached and independent from your body reaction, let's say.
Thank you. You want to reply?
So yes, yeah, thank you for that question. I don't know if I want to make I think there is a distinction to be made between performance art and visual or plastic arts and so forth. The main distinction I want to get at is between, yes, the performer in the act of performing, as opposed to observing. So the observer stance. So of course we can be watching dance and we can be watching or listening to music and so forth as observers. But I'm trying to get at the enactivist side of the story by starting with the actual performer. So that was the strategy. And I think what you say, that there is, of course, there's a performance of the artist who creates the painting, right? And maybe we can see part of that in the painting. But then also, I think what you were describing was something like the content, what's being represented in that painting, and isn't there a kind of narrative that we can have in it? Like the Caravaggio that Vittorio was looking at, I think, yes, where does that narrative come from? If I had no conception of the Christian background of what that painting was, I don't know how I would start that narrative, or that narrative might come out very different. So I think the cultural background is very important. And in this way, I think I agree with John Carvalho, who suggests that, yeah, looking at a painting is a kind of skill, being able to see in the painting the narrative, or being able to see because you've done it quite frequently, because you've read and are knowledgeable about a particular culture. That turns into a kind of skill, a know-how about how to look at paintings and so forth. So yeah. Thank
you. To answer your question, well, the last part of my talk was specifically devoted to show that even when you have to formulate an objective judgment of artistic beauty, the body is relevant, because if you manipulate the body, you affect in a congruent way the objective, apparently detached aesthetic judgment. And if you look at what's going on in the brain of someone who is merely looking at those paintings to determine whether they show emotion or not, the intensity of that activation positively correlates with the aesthetic evaluation of the very same image. The more activity in those areas, the more the people tend to see beautiful those very same images. So even without entering into the debate of what comes first, if there is any causal relationship, in order to form a causal relationship, you should first interfere with that brain area and then show that that has an impact. We did that with TMS on object shape, which was totally unrelated from aesthetic. So one should think about the experiment of this sort that may give a clue. And I don't know how far one can go along this line. I try to be very careful. I don't want to say that even aesthetic judgment, it's all embodiment, it's all bodily simulation, all there is that. But it certainly push you to want to know more.
Yes. Thank you, Vittorio.
Thank you very much. So, Young, do you have a question? Go ahead, please.
Hello, good afternoon. I do have a question indeed, but I think it was Miss Jane Pettigrew who kind of raised her hand first, so I think she should go first.
Sure. Jane, can you please ask your question? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Young. That was very generous of you. I'll make it as fast as I can. I'm a music educator, so in a way this question builds from Stefano's to some extent, but it asks you to think for a minute about the difference between spatial aesthetic experience and temporal aesthetic experience. In music education over the last few decades, there's been a return to ideas of improvisation as bridging between performative recreation of an idealized object that might exist a priori and more creative acts of art entanglement, art interaction. And the idea, I think, behind this is that bringing improvisation into performance studies makes the musical engagement more creative. I wonder if you both could talk at all about whether ideas of improvisation, whether that language is helpful to you in your studies and thinking.
Yeah, thank you for that question. Yeah, I think improvisation is an important topic. There are some people who argue that well, performance is a kind of improvisation. Even if we're playing from a score, there are changes, there are things going on that are kind of improvised as we go. So that, to me, is a very dynamic process. I have a student, Christian, who is here, I think, somewhere, and he's studying improvisation in dance. So it's a topic that we've been looking at in jazz performance and in dance. I think it's important. I'm not sure. I have a recent paper with another student who was looking at jazz improvisation, where we focused on a kind of resonance in the brain and in the body, which turned out to be a kind of important element of the whole process of improvising in jazz performance. Again, I would point to Simon Hofting's work in music, where he's also looking at these kinds of processes too. So I think it's important. I don't know if I have much more to say about that, just in a short response to that.
Thank you.
Yeah, same for me. I think it's a very interesting topic. I never dare to study improvisation because, you see, I mean, our approach, now I'm speaking for an empirical approach to these topics, it's always very artificial, very crude. You have to reduce many variables to a few because you need to repeat the same process time and time and again. So it would be very hard, for example, to study suspense with experiments, because as long as you need to have 20 or 50 replicas of the same stimulus to ameliorate your signal-to-noise ratio. So improvisation is definitely a very interesting topic. For example, I would be very curious to learn to which extent improvisation changes when you improvise alone with respect to when you improvise together with other people. So keeping always in focus the social dimension of everything, in my case, at least it would be interesting to see to which extent this mutual entrainment dynamics fuel to the creative process, and maybe it's different from instrument to instruments or music. I'm totally ignorant about that. So, but that would be a great topic for empirical investigation. By all means.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot for that question and for your answers. And we have very little time left. So, Jan, could you please ask your question?
Okay, thank you. I'll try to wrap through my question. So, so this is a question for Professor Gallese. And so first of all, thank you very much for the profound talk. I especially like the Ingmar Bergman persona image that you used towards the end of your slides. So my essential question is, to what degree this kind of body activation, or this activation of the part of the brain that's related to sensory motor activations, is unique to aesthetic experience? Now, the reason that I say this is because the body is involved in so many different things, and it just appears that as long as we are seeing something visual, or we can conceive something as being visual, and as long as we have a sense of self, the sensory motor cortex will be activated anyway.
Yeah.
So in other words, my question is, yes, do you see, like, so first of all, is it unique to aesthetic experience? Well, presumably the answer is no. But the important second bit of question is, do you see anything unique happening in the sensory motor cortex when people look at art, as opposed to when people are viewing non-aesthetic objects?
That's a very good question. And the short answer is that I don't know exactly yet. Because we have been, it's also a matter of emphasis, I think. This, which I hope will be the first part of our empirical research on aesthetic experience, has been focused unintentionally, but in the end, it was focused on charting the shared territory between everyday experience and aesthetic experience, if we qualify aesthetic experience in that particular way I think you are referring to. At the beginning of my talk, I said, for me, every experience is an aesthetic experience. But there are aesthetic experience of particular objects that probably, I think, to answer your question tentatively, I would say that there are some contextual constraints that probably modulate the response of my sensory motor system when I contemplate a cultural artifact with respect to when I contemplate a more mundane everyday object, which namely refers to my bodily stance. In our culture, well, okay, you may do jogging while listening to the audio version of War and Peace, which of course doesn't apply to what I'm about to say. But that aside, in a traditional cultural experience, most of the time you are still. You are still, and so you don't need to bother to check your balance, predict possible steps on your walk or intrusion, people trying to harm you, all these sort of things. You are still, and what's also important, you have that particular aesthetic experience in a very peculiar context, in a dedicated place, concert hall, movie theater, museum, art exhibition, your living room, your bedroom. So all places where you are less en garde with respect to physical reality than you normally are when you are commuting or when you are working or dealing with other people. None now in the specific sense being involved in a. So that's why I totally feel the urge and the necessity to specify what makes the aesthetic experience of artworks special in a way, if it is, and I think it is. I spoke of augmented reality. One way is to focusing on the enabling condition of this specific set of experiences that might be relevant. I don't know if I answer your question, but they are looking at me and I should shut up.
Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot for this very interesting discussion.
Yeah, we could have gone on.
Um,
So is it over? Shall we say goodbye now?
Not yet, not yet.
Not yet. So, we are a little bit out of time, but if you're okay to reply to the very last question, we'd like to ask you advice for early career researchers. And what was your experience and why you became interested in aesthetics? To both of our speakers.
Yeah. So it's difficult for me to say why I became interested in aesthetics. I'm interested in embodied cognition, and so wherever that leads me, that's where I go. So opportunities sometimes present themselves for me to become interested in some things. But I was serious that I don't really have a deep background in aesthetics. I haven't studied aesthetics all my life or anything like that. So I don't consider myself specifically in that area. Embodied cognition, however, is something I'm very interested in, embodiment and so forth. So I don't know about advice, if I'm the best person to give any advice about this. I would just say, really find something you love to do and pursue it.
Thank you.
Well, in my case, I think it's a must for someone like me who is a cognitive social neuroscientist. What's more cognitive than art and aesthetics? So in spite of the fact that most of our colleagues consider this not particularly interesting, I've been asked many times, why do you do this? Wait until you retire. That's the kind of thing you do when you are retired. Demented, reply. No, I'm joking, but I mean, it's not good for your career if you are in cognitive neuroscience to do empirical aesthetics as we speak. But I think it's one of the key issues to be addressed, particularly now, and I'm even more convinced of that after the bloody pandemic took over. I mean, aesthetics is one of the key issues to understand contemporary time, what kind of society we are living in, where are we heading to. So aesthetics in broader terms. So what do I suggest? Don't care about what your colleagues do. Follow your enthusiasm. This is one of the most fascinating topics one could imagine of. Study a lot. There's a lot of stuff to be learned. I try to do it, and I mean, so there's a lot of homework to be done. So that's why many people say, well, why bother? Science, who cares? Or art, who cares? It's double work, but it pays back.
Thank you very much. Well, I'll just take the chance to end, well, actually, with this call that we are launching as part of our text and images project, which is an opportunity for students and artists to collaborate to explore areas of intersection between theology and art. So please, if you're interested in this possibility, just get in touch with me. I'll be happy to give you more information. And then, Marina, would you like to tell a bit more about the next upcoming seminar?
Yes. Thank you very much. Yes, Art and Conversation will continue next semester. We'll have even more seminars next semester, so you're all welcome. Just take a look at our website. In some time, we'll upload the program for the next semester. Thank you very much, everyone, and we really hope to see you next semester.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.